Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this AHDB webinar where we'll be discussing how to choose the right KPIs for your sheep farm. My name is Chloe McKee, Knowledge Transfer Manager for Beef and Lamb, AHDB, and this evening I'll run through the housekeeping and ask your questions during the Q&A. Our speakers this evening are Andy Jones and Sarah Herford. Andy is a small ruminant experimental manager at Rothamsted Research and has just finished his PhD, which we'll hear about shortly. And Sarah is in charge of the business content within AHDB and has a background in farm business consultancy. So the plan of action is that Andy will run through his recent findings and then we'll move on to Sarah's presentation and have a demo of the KPI Express calculator. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so at any time and all questions are anonymous. If you click on the orange arrow to expand your toolbar options and then click on the little drop-down arrow where it says questions, and you'll see where you can type your question in. So Andy, if you wouldn't mind just moving on to the next slide, please. Brilliant, thank you. And if you're having any technical problems this evening, please type it into the questions box too, and we'll do our best to help. The usual advice is to log out and come back in. So Andy, I'll hand over to you to begin the presentation, please.
Okay, thank you, Chloe, and thank you to those joining us this evening. So yeah, my name's Andy Jones. I have just finished being a AHDB-funded PhD student, and my research interests predominantly revolve around the use of information on sheep farms and how this information can be used to drive tangible change. Now, before I get into my presentation proper, I just wanted to briefly talk about the research site that I've been based at for the last 4 years. It's called the Northwick Farm Platform, and we're based down near Oakhampton in Devon. So the main premise of the Northwick site is that it hosts, as I said, the Northwick Farm Platform, which has the accolade of being the most highly instrumented research farm in the whole world. Now, essentially, it comprises 3 small independent commercial farms, which are known locally as farmlets, each of which uses a different grazing strategy. So, on the red farmlet, it's planned reseeding, so it's been high sugar Italian ryegrass for the last few years. On the blue, it's legumes and ryegrass, and on the green, it's permanent pasture. Now, the whole purpose of this site is to look at interactions between grazing cattle and the pasture, and there's, as I said before, there's a huge amount of instrumentation, a very high resolution of data collecting going on. Now, to look at, as I mentioned, the interaction between the livestock and the actual grazing system itself, each farmlet has its own herd of 30 stabilizer cattle, and also a flock of 75 ewes and their lambs. They are Suffolk Cross North Country mules with Charolais rams. As I said, in order to look at the interaction between the livestock and the grazing. Now, what this has meant is that over the last 10 years, we've had a huge amount of data collected. It's very high resolution data, nearly 3,500 lambs produced there, just under 800 ewes across the 3 different grazing systems. Now, the reason why I mention this is just to demonstrate the size of the data set that I've been able to work with to look at basically how best to use this information to drive tangible change. Okay, so on to my PhD project. So I'm going to discuss in depth one of the main study, which was kind of the linchpin of my project. And as you can see there, the main aim of it was to rank different metrics for the sheep production systems according to economic value of information. So, as you can see before you, this is a list of key performance indicators, and this is pretty much directly lifted off the AHDB website. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of KPIs you can use. When you first look at them, this can be quite daunting because there's so much information you can record. So a bit of guidance on what should be recorded is definitely worthwhile. So in this project, the first thing that we did was try and define exactly what the purpose of each of these metrics is. And the way that we did this was by coming up with 3 terms and then allocating these metrics into one of these groups. So that's predictors, outcomes, and descriptors. So predictors, these are metrics which are a good way of estimating performance, but are not directly aligned to performance itself. So this is in economics known as leading indicators. So if we take, for example, the birth weight of lambs, that's not going to get you any money. You don't get any actual, economic output from that. However, it's a pretty good way of predicting what the slaughter age will be, which is itself directly aligned to your production costs. So next is outcome, and that, as it sounds, is more directly aligned to performance outputs. So to continue the previous example, if we look at slaughter age, that itself is directly linked to your slaughter age of your lambs, and therefore is a performance outcome. Now, the third one is descriptor, and this isn't, well, in the way we've defined it, it's not strictly speaking a key performance indicator. It's more of a way of defining the system that you're working within, more of a rule of engagement. So if we take, for example, the ewe to ram ratio, that's something that is a direct decision made by the farmer, so it's not necessarily an indicator of performance. Okay, so now we've defined what the purpose of these different metrics is. The next step was to try and attribute value to these performance metrics in a way that's fair to compare them. And the way that we did this was by looking at the relationship between the performance predictors and the performance outcomes. Okay, so the mechanism that we came up with, it's quite a simple mechanism once you kind of understand it, but it is quite a good way of valuing these different metrics. So what we did was take, for this example in particular, we took a performance predictor, so birth weight, for example, and a performance outcome, so let's take slaughter age again, and look at the link between the two. So within our data set, we had quite a range over the 10 years in birth weight, so 2.2 kilograms to 8.5 kilograms. We ordered all animals according to this, this performance predictor. And allocated them into one of three groups according to that predictor, so low, mid, and high groups. We then calculated the average output, depending on which output we were looking at, and then calculated the difference between the top and the bottom group to give us our information value. So to put this another way, if we were able to intervene at the stage of the performance predictor, and move an animal from a low performing group into a high performing group, what would be the benefit of doing that? And in this example, that would be a saving in 39.9 days from birth to slaughter. Okay, so we then applied this metric to 10 different performance predictors. And just to keep things nice and simple, we looked at lamb growth in particular, and then shaded them according to the strength of positive association. So from the previous slide, you can see there, that's a relationship between the birth weight and the slaughter age, which is a saving of 39.9 days. And we looked at two different performance outputs, so slaughter age to give us an idea of kind of cost of production, and carcass value to give us a production output. If we look at carcass value in particular, this is lamb carcass value, and we see that the best one there is the ewes weight at lambing. So that was the performance predictor associated with the biggest difference in lamb carcass values, so the one with the greatest information value essentially. If we look a little bit further down, so the carcass value of lambs there, for example, and that's again a very strong predictor, and it also has got the best benefit if we look at slaughter age as well, so saving in nearly 85 days there, and a carcass value of £2.20. Now, the reason why the increase in weaning weight shows an improvement in lamb carcass value could potentially be explained by another study, which I conducted a few years back, and that essentially investigated the link between a lamb's weight at weaning and their subsequent carcass quality. So you may have spotted this in Farmers Weekly if you're a big fan of mine. But yeah, essentially, lambs which are heavier at weaning will have a better carcass conformation and also a lower fat class. Okay, so the previous table I showed you, that was looking at performance predictors in isolation, and just the information value of each predictor on its own. However, KPIs are very seldom used by themselves. So the next step and the next thing we wanted to look at was how they interacted with each other, and essentially what's the cumulative benefit of recording multiple aspects of the farm enterprise. So I'll just explain this plot for you briefly. So along the y-axis, so up the side, that's the benefit, and the benefit for this particular plot was carcass value. So that 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's in pounds of lamb carcass value. Along the bottom, as it says, that's the number of metrics used, so 1, 2, and up to 10. So for example, number 1, that's 3 symbols above it, the circle, triangle, and cross. That's the best individual metric, and the average of individual metrics, and the worst single individual metric for one metric being used. And as you go across to the right, we tried that again, but with different numbers of metrics. So a couple things that this kicked out. Firstly was if you're just looking at a small number of things, so for example 2 metrics, there's quite a substantial difference in the potential benefit you can gain from using this information. So that's what, probably around £2.50 difference between using the worst 2 possible metrics of the 10 and the best 2 possible metrics of the 10. Another thing this highlighted was the fact that at 4 metrics being used, that was where peak information value was reached. So essentially what that means was after more metrics were included, the information value actually decreased. So this suggests that there's very much a sweet spot of how much information you should be recording before it actually starts to muddy the water and dilute the benefit of recording information. Okay, so it's good to know and it's useful. However, it's only useful if we know exactly which metrics are the best ones. And that's what's identified within this plot. So just to, again, quickly point out what's going on here. So the shaded columns is a number of different metrics being used. And within those shaded columns, there's 3 columns, which is the best, second best, and third combination of that number of metrics. And this is useful because not only does it identify which the best metrics are, but it also shows trends across different combinations. So as I kind of identified previously, and it shows true when multiple metrics are used, ewe body condition score and weight at lambing are seen right across the board and all different numbers of metrics being used. Now the reason for this is probably pretty clear, which is the better condition that you're using just before lactation, the better lambs are going to grow, which itself leads to having better quality carcasses when they're slaughtered, and therefore higher value associated with that carcass. On the flip side, we saw that ewe's body condition score and weight at weaning very seldom appeared in these different numbers of metric combinations. And now the reason for this is less clear. However, it's likely to do with the variation in the amount of weight and condition that ewes lose during lactation. So there's variation essentially in the amount of condition that goes off the ewe's back while she's feeding the lamb. If you took 2 ewes which both reared very good lambs, some of them will take more off the back, others will be able to maintain that those body reserves better. So because of this variation, it's hard to use this this point in time to actually estimate how well their lambs performed. Okay, so very briefly, firstly I want to talk about accounting for the cost of actually collecting the data, and then I want to very briefly talk about how this information can be used to define actionable benchmarks. Okay, so when we were writing this study, we were very aware that this information doesn't come for free. You need to actually go out and collect the information, and that requires equipment, and it also requires your time. So to try and account for that, we came up with 3 different costing scenarios. So scenario 1, which is probably the least likely, which is you've gone out and you bought a weigh crate and all the equipment specifically for measuring this particular metric, whatever it is we're talking about. So ewe weight, condition score, and lamb weight, for example. Scenario number 2, is that you've gone out and you purchased this equipment to measure the predictor in question, but as you've got it, you've also used it for once a year weighing of your lambs just before they go off the slaughter. Scenario 3, which is the most likely one, which is you've already got the weigh crate kicking about on your farm, so there's no equipment cost. However, there is a labour cost because you still need to go and get them in from the field and actually weigh the things. So when we use these 3 costing scenarios alongside a single metric benefit, as we showed a few tables back, now we can see obviously there's quite a difference in the potential benefit according to the 3 costing scenarios. No huge surprise there. And it also shows that the actual kind of strength positive association remains the same across the different metrics. So weighted lambing, for example, stays the very strongest predictor. So that's just quite reassuring to see. But it does, of course, also confirm that there is a cost associated, so you should be careful which predictors you're using to get the best information value. Okay, so just finally, just want to talk briefly about defining actionable benchmarks. So what we've done here is essentially back calculate what you should be aiming at in order to actually put this information into practice. So to calculate this, we essentially use the same metric as I introduced before, so ordering animals by a predictor variable, so in this case the ewes weight at lambing, and then looking at the output of the groups split by this variable. However, in this example, we split just in half, and we split them according to a varying position. So that position on the left-hand column there, we changed it by ewes weight. So, for example, the top column there, we split it by ewe weight at lambing being 86 kilograms. So top group was 86 kilograms and above, bottom group was below 86 kilograms, and looked at the difference in an output between the 2. So if we look at the biggest difference, here was £3.62 in lamb carcass value between ewes split according to this criteria. It's a substantial difference, £3.62. However, in order to actually apply an intervention to the flock, this would have to be applied to 85% of all the ewes, which of course is quite a substantial proportion. This plot shows essentially that table, but in graphic format. So the blue chunk there is the proportion of the flock that would need to be affected. The red line being the difference in carcass value. So that's where we were before. So that's 84 kilograms, and you see there's a decent proportion of the flock that would need to be need to have the intervention applied to it. So I don't have any major kind of take home from this particular final exercise here, and of course I'm fully aware that encouraging heavier ewes, will have detrimental impact in other areas. So you have lower ewe efficiency, for example. Now, however, it is a useful exercise to try and see if we're going to apply these interventions and back calculate how much of the flock should this be applied to. Okay, so thank you very much. That's just some of my recent work that I've been looking at. Some kind of straight away take home message from this is that the ewe's condition and weight at lambing is of course very important, and also the lamb's weight at weaning is important, not just for growth rates, but also because it can lead to a more valuable carcass when they're finally slaughtered. Okay, thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions and have a discussion on what I just talked about.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks very much, Andy. We've got a couple of questions. We'll move on to Sarah, and then we'll go through the Q&A at the end.
Fab. Thanks, Chloe. I'm hoping you can see the right screen now. So yes, my name's Sarah Herford, as Chloe said earlier, and I look after the business resources that we have. And one of those things that's very useful for this process is a KPI Express tool. Within the tool, there's lots of different KPIs that are useful to your farm, and they've all been justified with the industry as to why they're important and why they can really help improve performance on farm. And they're crudely split into 2 blocks for sheep. So we've got breeding flock KPIs, and that's production of lambs, production of ewes, and costs of production, and then store lambs. So within the breeding flock, you've got different sorts of production of lamb KPIs. So different ones for outdoor systems and indoor systems, if that's what your system is. And then we've got some about numbers and weighing of lambs as well. So that's quite useful if, as Andy was saying, you don't have the tools to do the job for weighing just yet, or you're planning to buy them and you haven't got them. You've at least got some KPIs there that you can action anyway. On the store lamb side, we also have some production KPIs and some cost of production KPIs as well. There's a few less here because it's a lot simpler system to run effectively, and there's a lot less different places to measure and collect things. So in terms of how this runs, it's probably just as well to show you the tool itself. So if I go into here, the KPI Express calculator sits on our farm business review platform tool, which I can talk a little bit more about to start with. But once you've registered and set up an account, it's very easy to enter your enterprises. So if I enter a new enterprise here, I'm going to have a beef and lamb enterprise for my breeding flock. And I'm just going to call it flock test for the moment. So once I've created my enterprise, it gives me all of these different KPIs to choose from. And I was going to look at lamb losses from scanning to rearing, because this is something that you should all have anyway. You should all have some figures and numbers added up if you don't have scales or weigh facilities on the farm. So once you've clicked to enter the KPI, you can choose when you'd like to do this KPI for. So you might choose that you put in 2 or 3 years worth of data, and you can enter it twice to get a comparison of year to year. You might have a feeling that you've had an issue that year and it's thrown it out of kilter somewhat. So if we go for 31st of December, and then it shows you this KPI period recorded over, just to make sure you know which calendar year you're aiming for. So if you've already got a management software in place and you already have a result, there is a tab that says add my result here, and you can just type in the figure if you know what it is. But if you're not sure what it is, or you're not sure if the definition in this tool is quite the same as what your management software uses, you can calculate it here. So I've got some figures here from a farm I've been to recently. So they had 60 ewes with singles, 70 with twins, and only 20 with triplets. And then in total, I think I've got it penned down right, that they had about 240 lambs reared from those sheep pregnancies. So if we save this KPI, just takes a minute to do its sums, it comes up with a range of what it's expected. So this was obviously doing very, very, let's add it up right. Anyway, it shows you a scale of where it's performing on traffic lights there. So we've got red being review performance, yellow being we ought to improve there somewhere, and green being performing very well on the farm. I think I've put my performance a bit too high on that one, so perhaps a bit ambitious with the figures. On the side here, we've also got these links. So if it says perhaps you should be reviewing your performance a bit in here, you can look in and say, well, actually, this ewe nutrition here would be really useful, and that will take you to some of our other AHDB resources on the website. So let's say I want to go back and add some more KPIs, and I might want to add some to my breeding flock. But for this example, I was going to go back out and find my store lamb enterprise. So if I add a new KPI here, and I will add some mortality figures, I think, and I'll put in the same year end date. And I can say I had purchased 350 lambs, and I have had 16 that have died in that time. And I've done very poorly on this one. So again, it shows you a good range. So it's a very good way of benchmarking of what industry standards are and to show how far you are off of the mark, or indeed if you're doing particularly well. And it also gives you, again, some nice further information here relevant to what you've clicked on. So each of the different KPIs have got different resources that are relevant to that particular one. So this one here has got neonatal survival and antibiotic plans, and also some reducing lamb losses information and worm control as well. If you get stuck on any of these at any point, there is a definition at the bottom to say what's being defined in that point. And if you also look in when you're adding the KPI, there's a bit of a reason up here as to what the importance of this particular one is. So within all of those lists of KPIs, there will be some relevant to your business and are of interest of something that you're trying to target on the farm. We also have some financial KPIs, and this is quite a new addition to the tool. So we have a balance sheet one, which is net worth trend, and a profit and loss one, which is net profit margin. So the net worth trend there on the left shows the business to be performing well at 3%, and that means that the total assets from the farm have increased by 3% over the course of the 12 months. And the net profit margin one is effectively how much profit is left from as a proportion of the income at the end of the trading year. And this is sort of on the borderline of performing well or room to improve at 7%. So these sorts of figures you can use in many ways, and it helps you have an overview of the whole farm's performance. So if you've got sheep enterprises, perhaps you've got some suckler cows and a little bit of arable, it will be able to do a snapshot of the whole picture and how it sits. So at the moment, AHDB has a DEFRA contract with for a farm resilience fund. So there's some consultancy time available, and it's using this farm business review tool, of which includes the KPI Express calculator that we've just been looking at. So it's half a day's consultancy time for farmers in England for the raising awareness of BPS changes and how that's going to impact your profit levels on farm and any alternative income streams you could find, such as environmental schemes, but also anything in terms of profit sufficiency and changes you can make on farm to improve the resilience. You can register on these links here. If not, just drop us an email and we'll get somebody in touch with you. If not, all you need to register are some contact details and an SBI number. But if you've already taken up this service elsewhere and given your SBI number, because there's several suppliers, then you won't be able to have multiple bites at the cherry as such. So that's my piece done. And I'll pass back to Chloe, but any questions, do feel free to put them in the chat.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So the first question, Sarah, will be for you. How would you use those financial metrics that you've just mentioned in order to plan for the future, please? Yeah, so once you've looked at the net profit, it's quite useful to work out where the other proportion of costs are. So if you've got a nice proportion of profit left, you can see whether, well, actually, should I be reducing my variable costs or other parts of my business in line to increase my profit proportion. But you can also, we've got some really useful web pages to walk that through into cash, to work out cash flow. And if you've got some big projects on the horizon, how much of that cash is left for reinvestment in the business. So for example, buildings or breeding livestock, that sort of thing. Oh, brilliant, thanks. Yeah, we have got the cash flow calculator, haven't we? And I've also put a link in the follow-up email to this webinar to the business review page. So there's lots of worksheets and printable things on there. Andy, the next one's for you. As a result of your findings, what is sort of the one key piece of advice you would give to farmers, please?
Okay, so I think the one thing I'd say is to try and find that sweet spot of how much information to record. I think, as I kind of mentioned before, We found a peak information value, and after that, it just started to kind of dilute the benefits. So I think particularly the tool that's been demonstrated here is a fantastic way to kind of understand how your farm is performing. And once you know what areas you're not so good on, you can then explore that and kind of go down, do a bit more detail in certain areas to find out how you can improve on specific areas. So yeah, kind of identify what bits of your farm enterprise need improving and then record information on that.
So you would suggest picking out sort of 3 to 4 maximum, is that right?
Yeah, I'd say so. 4 seems to be the optimal from the data that I've looked at, but so around that mark.
Brilliant, thank you. And in one of your previous examples, you mentioned the U-weight metric. Now, would you advise using that in conjunction with BCS rather than on its own?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously there's going to be a huge amount of variation between different breeds and systems. The information that I've shown, I showed earlier, was from just one farm system and one breed type. What's good for your farm, and you know what targets you should be aiming for, is going to be very much specific to your own system. So yeah, definitely body condition score gives you a much more, I suppose, transferable way of judging how good your used energy reserves. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. And the final question, unless any sneak in the next couple of minutes. Andy, is there a way that we could use some of the data you've shown today and do the same thing for cattle? Is that something that farmers could calculate themselves?
Yeah, no, I don't see why not. Certainly the way we designed that framework and that metric was to be transferable to different farming systems. There's even suggesting it could perhaps be transferred to an arable type system as well. So long as you have a kind of mid-season predictor variable and an outcome you're aiming for, then yeah, you can certainly order by one and judge the output by the other, and then yeah, try and work out which are the best ones to use.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, thank you very much both. We have reached the end of the webinar this evening and the end of the questions. I would just like to remind everyone that the presentation and the questions have been recorded this evening. So they will be available on the AHDB Beef and Lamb YouTube channel, and you'll also receive a link to this recording in a follow-up email with links to the various tools and services that were mentioned this evening. There will also be a feedback form, so if you have time, we'd really appreciate it if you could let us know how you found the webinar this evening and any topics you'd like to see in the future. So thanks, Sarah and Andy, for giving up your time this evening. And thanks everyone else at home for listening. Enjoy the rest of your evenings.